Morning, Dan and Amy. We're going to talk to our friend Steve Cortes momentarily, CNN political commentator and former head of Trump's Hispanic Advisory Council. And I know the talk is about the G7 summit, but ultimately that's just a proxy for a talk about America's economy and economic growth, isn't it? I mean, that's why trade policy has dominated the conversation and continues to, particularly with the protectionist impulses of the president and many of his advisors, not named Larry Kudlow. So I just want to point people to something Bill Maher said on his intolerable, politically incorrect show, whatever it's called, on HBO.
Ugh, I can't stand Bill Maher.
No, he's.
I mean, he rubs me the wrong way, but I want to hear what he said.
Right, and so, but the one thing he does is he gives voice to some of what the left actually thinks, but are unwilling to say, such as this, for example.
I feel like the bottom has to fall out at some point, and by the way, I'm hoping for it, because I think one way you get rid of Trump is a crashing economy. Yeah. So please bring on the recession. Yeah. Sorry if that hurts people, but it's either root for a recession or you lose your democracy.
Root for a recession or lose your democracy. Rooting for a recession. Well, weren't conservatives who disagreed with Obama's economic policies criticized for cheering against the president, cheering against America, because we didn't believe in things like the backdoor takeover of U.S. healthcare?
It didn't matter what political party you were in. Last time we had a recession, people lost tens of thousands of dollars from their 401ks. So we're just finally starting to get back. Bill Maher can pound sand. He's got enough money to say something stupid like that.
Rooting for a recession. Well, that's what champagne socialists do. For more on this, we're joined by the aforesaid Steve Cortes. Steve, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good morning, Dan, Amy. Thanks for having me.
How about Bill Maher rooting for a recession because we have to do anything short of nuclear war to get rid of Trump?
Right. Well, between Bill Maher and then Robert De Niro, I would say to smug Hollywood elites, please keep talking down to us and keep condescending to the American people, because you're going to ensure a Trump win, an even bigger win in 2020, the way that they lecture us. And Maher, I'll give him credit for honesty at least. He would rather see America fail than see Trump succeed. And I think that is true of a lot of the people on the left. He's just willing to be honest enough to say it, so I'll at least give him credit for that. But I won't give him credit for being as out of touch with as he is. The fact that liberal elites live a very different life than the rest of America, particularly working class folks, middle class people, largely in the middle of the country, who elected this president, the fact that they're as disconnected as they are is, I think, one of the problems in our country, and one of the reasons that we're as divided as we are as a country, is because cultural elites have no real understanding of where middle income Americans and frankly struggling working class Americans have lived for the last decade. Thankfully, the news on that front is getting dramatically better, whether Bill Maher likes it or not.
Well, what about this spat between President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau and this tariff on dairy and then possible tariff on tobacco? I mean, do you think that this is needed?
I don't know if it's needed or not, but I think what Trump did, by the way, and this gets, of course, very little attention in mainstream media, he went in there and actually laid down, an incredibly aggressive offer. He said, how about we eliminate all tariffs, everyone? Because the United States will benefit disproportionately from doing so, because in general, not in every case, but in general, our tariffs are far lower than other countries. Of course, they rejected that offer because they want managed trade. And I think there's a misconception out there that we've had this era of sort of golden free trade. That's just not the reality. We have incredibly managed trade, even with our friends, maybe even worse in some cases with our friendly nations. And it's been managed mostly to the detriment of the U.S. And we get the short end of the stick on most of these deals. A lot of that was done in years and decades past to try to help the world recover, way back post-World War II, for instance. But we're in a very different economic era now. And the fact that we don't have reciprocal trade, the fact that countries like China abuse us, particularly with theft of intellectual property. Trump is coming and saying that while this does serve the Davos crowd very well, it serves the elites, whether corporate elites or political elites of the U.S., Europe, G7. It serves them very well. It doesn't serve working class people well in the United States, and that's what he was elected to do, is to, frankly, not tinker around the edges, but smash those kinds of constructs that haven't brought prosperity and security to the U.S.
Well, I mean, I'll give him credit for suggesting that both tariffs be essentially eliminated, as well as subsidies, both ends of it,
right.
Both ends of mercantilism. So that's what he said, but what he's done is mercantilism, neo-mercantilism, the opposite. And so I know Trump defenders are quick to say, over the last 2 years in response to some of his more controversial or outlandish statements. One is supposed to take Trump seriously, but not literally. Well, are we supposed to take him seriously, but not literally on free trade? Or are we supposed to take his actions literally, since that's what ultimately has the impact? And what he's literally done, despite what Larry Kudlow is suggesting he's doing, is impose taxes on goods, and that's not good.
Right. Well, listen, I'll say this. I think that where he wants to go, which he says, and I believe him, he wants to go to true free trade, the elimination of tariffs, because, again, that will be wonderful for America. Number one, because we'll outcompete our competitors. But number two, we're getting a raw deal right now in this managed trade that exists. Again, we don't live in a fairy tale land that they want to pretend we live in, a free trade, where the Davos crowd would like to convince the public that that situation exists. It doesn't. So I think then he backtracks, well, if we can't get there, and it doesn't look like we can right now, then if we're playing the game of managed trade, we're going to manage it better in our interest. And the United States for so long has not played in the international arena, whether it's security or economic structures. We have not played as though we have the strong hand. When we do, we have the strongest hand. I mean, we're looking at a straight flush, but we're playing like we have a pair of nines off at negotiating tables. And Trump is saying, enough of that.
But would you agree that this is short-term pain? At minimum, it is short-term pain. Short-term, this is not a good policy, and the medium-term concern is there's Kudlow on one side and Lighthizer and Navarro and Wilbur Ross on the other, and it seems like the troika of the other three is winning.
Right. No, listen, and I'll concede that. Again, this isn't a good thing to see. And you're right. Tariffs are a tax. They are absolutely a tax. Tariffs are a bad thing, in and of themselves. And I tend to line up far more with the Larry Kudlow side. He's my friend. Did a lot of TV with him over the years. And for instance, I can say, because I don't work for the president directly, I think that claiming national security rationales to protect steel, for instance, I think that's a big stretch and a mistake, quite honestly. My guess is Larry probably thinks that too. He can't say so because he works in the White House. But also, listen, there's a vigorous debate going on. That I can tell you, and that's public knowledge. There's a very vigorous debate going on among some of the very parties that you cite. I think some of the more anti-tariff crowds, pro-trade crowds, were the kind of the Goldman Sachs group, people like Gary Cohn, Dina Powell, who left the White House. I think that side got a stronger voice when they were in the White House. Right now, I think Larry, in some ways, is alone fighting. But look, I'm also not trying to portray that there's any great chasm, within the administration. I mean, Larry Kudlow wants free trade, but does also believe that the U.S. has been abused. We've been abused by a lack of reciprocity, lack of openness to their markets, by tariff situations which are not symmetrical. In other words, their tariffs are far higher than ours on their goods. And then I think even more importantly, perhaps than those two issues, is the issue of theft of intellectual property. I mean, that is because that is where China, for instance, and they're the worst abuser of it, China can vault ahead, decades of economic advancement, not by doing the hard work of R&D like the U.S. has to do in innovation, but by just simply stealing it, sometimes openly, sometimes not so openly, but regardless, the point is they're taking it and we've allowed it. And I think this president smartly is saying, enough. It's not just, and it's not right for American workers.
What do you think of President Trump's suggestion to make the G7 back to a G8 and invite Putin? Because isn't Russia's economy similar to Italy's? They're not that big
right.
of a player.
That I don't see the president's logic, quite frankly. And, I rarely disagree with this president, but I don't see that. The reason I don't see it, because you're right. For one thing, their economy is, I don't agree often with John McCain, but he was correct when he says that they're, a country masquerading or a gas station masquerading as a country. So they're nothing like the rest of the G7. And even more importantly, the G7 isn't just about economics. It's supposed to be about shared values, right? That these are liberal democracies, which clearly Russia is not. So from that perspective, I don't see the reason to include Russia. Now, if it were primarily about national security, then I would argue Russia absolutely should be at the table. I mean, not that we agree with them on very much at all, but as the second biggest nuclear power in the world, I think dialogue is really, really important when it comes to security issues. But the G7 is primarily an economic alliance, and for that reason, I don't think they belong in there. I think that's a mistake by the president.
What do you think Trump needs to get out of his sit-down with Kim Jong-un?
I would hope for, as a base case, something to end the Korean War. When I say something, hopefully a full formal agreement to end the Korean War. I think that alone would be a huge achievement and a great step to de-escalate the Korean Peninsula. But of course, what we're all hoping for, I think, is a much grander promise of total denuclearization of the peninsula. And what I think he's going to offer, we'll see, the world will find out soon, I think he's going to offer a slow withdrawal of American presence there. And that is very fitting with his philosophy of we are overextended, we're over-interventionist around the world. A lot of our allies, South Korea is a great example, wealthy country, not doing enough for its own security, probably the same for Japan, across the water from Korea. So what I think he'll offer them, I don't know this, I have no inside information, but I think he'll say, we will slowly start to extricate our presence from the Korean Peninsula in exchange for verifiable denuclearization. What I'd also love to see him put on the table, and I didn't talk to him, but I floated this to people in the White House, is also offer, for instance, this would be a great opportunity, offer free trade. Tell North and South Korea, both of you countries and the U.S., let's have zero tariffs between the three countries. Wouldn't that be an amazing arrangement? And talk about a way to guarantee peace. I mean, trade and commerce is a terrific way to do that. We tend to not go to war against our customers, right?
That's true, unless they've got fake eyebrows. Then at least we have rhetorical war, if nothing else. Let me ask you this. You're a financial services guy. That's your background. Jerome Powell, Fed chairman, holds a presser this week, expected to hike the benchmark interest rate for the second time this year, and may announce that instead of 3 rate hikes, we are going to get 4 this year. How does that play with the aspirational 4% GDP growth annually?
Right. Listen, we're trying to thread the needle economically of normalizing Fed policy, which is a great thing, by the way. I mean, artificially low interest rates are dangerous. They create all kinds of misallocations of capital. They punish savers. So there's a lot of things that are wrong with super, super low interest rates. And rates have been rising lately, but rising modestly, which is, I think, exactly what you want, and rising for the right reason, which is because wages are finally rising, the economy is growing quicker. Now, to your point, though, are they going to take away the punch bowl and spoil the party at exactly the wrong time, right when it starts to go? My guess is that the economy can handle it, that there's enough optimism out there, there's enough small business confidence, enough hiring, for instance, that we can handle the rate hikes, and I hope so, and I believe so. Certainly financial markets believe it right now. Financial markets are very healthy, so I think we can do this. But it's a great thing, by the way, that Fed meetings and Fed normalizing the policy has become really kind of not news. It doesn't even really get attention. That's great for our country because if you remember, in the depths of the crisis and into, say 2011, 2012 even, we were fixated on this. And, how can the Fed at that point, it was the opposite of not only not normalizing, but the Fed constantly trying to add stimulus to the U.S. economy. And that's central planning in many ways at its worst. We're getting out of that now. We're getting back to, instead of always talking about Fed policy, now we're starting to talk about what are companies doing? What are earnings doing? How's the economy growing? And by the way, on that score, the Atlanta Fed has a model, a statistical model, so it's not somebody's opinion. And that model now ticked all the way up to 4.8 GDP growth for this current quarter. Now, that model moves around a lot. It's volatile, so that does not at all mean that we're going to end there. But if we're even in the neighborhood, of possibly a 4 handle on GDP growth, what that will do for this country, for middle-income workers, for our prosperity as a whole, will just be amazing. And, fingers crossed, I think we're going there.
But as our friend Jamie Pethokoukis points out, we still have a worker productivity stagnation problem.
Right.
And worker productivity, meaning rising standard of living. If that doesn't tick up, then you question where the growth's going to come from. And he makes one point that would be interesting for Trump to make, which is the immigrant entrepreneurs and how critical they are to the dynamism of the U.S. economy. 40% of Fortune 500 companies founded by first or second generation immigrants. More than half the nation's billion-dollar startups have an immigrant co-founder. So when it comes to, bringing people to this country, allowing admittance to this country, people who are value adders, who are innovators and disruptors, we want to do that, don't we? Maybe it's something the president should stress more often.
Yeah, no, I'd like to hear him talk more about that. About one of the reasons that we're trying to crack down, I think, as a country so much on illegal immigration is because it's an affront to legal immigration. And even legal immigration, we can do better, I think, through a merit-based system. We need to, in my view, I think the president put a really reasonable compromise in front of the Democrats. We'll protect the DACA young adults, but in exchange, we're going to restrict chain migration, move to more of a merit-based system, eliminate the visa lottery system. But you're right. I'd like to see him talk more about the dynamism that they do bring to our country, and it is incredible. Hispanics, for example, are by far statistically the most likely people in America to start businesses. We love mom-and-pop operations that we hope become a lot bigger than that. So I want more of that. And to your point of productivity, it's a critical one. It's one of the reasons that wages haven't been rising is, quite frankly, I mean, it sounds a little harsh, but workers, if they're not getting more productive, they don't deserve a raise, right? But why have they not been more productive? It's not because they're not working hard. I would argue it's, again, a consequence largely of Fed policy in the past. Because of super low interest rates, companies were incentivized to engage in financial engineering, so share buybacks, big dividends to their investors. Wonderful for the owners of assets, by the way, that's a tiny percentage of America, though, who own really significant assets. Terrible for wage earners, and what they weren't doing, these companies, was investing in capital expenditures, in software, plants, technology, people. And when you don't do that, you don't get productivity gains. So I think that's coming, but that is also a slow process. Productivity isn't something that shows up tomorrow. I mean, it's like a weight loss program. It takes time, right? But the good news is, so far, the signs are CapEx is soaring. If that continues, then I think in coming years, we're going to finally see the kind of productivity that we got in the 80s and 90s. And you're exactly right. It's kind of one of the missing stories of why this century has been so tough so far, the 2000s, for working class people. I think the primary reason is a lack of productivity. But I also think that the solution is what President Trump's doing: cutting taxes, cutting regulation, normalizing interest rates on the Fed side. Let's get companies spending on CapEx, and let's get productive and earn raises again.
That makes sense to me. He is Steve Cortes, CNN political commentator who serves on the Trump Hispanic Advisory Council. Steve, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
You bet. Have a great day.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.